What I'm going to do today is mostly tell you about some work that I've been doing on the relationship between economic geography and literary geography in the 20th century. This stuff is exciting to me. Of course, everyone's excited about their own research, but particularly because it's some of the first sort of large-scale text mining stuff that's been done in literary studies on 20th century materials, which have long had problems about just assembling a suitable corpus due to copyright issues and that sort of thing. I'll tell you a little bit about what the corpus is as we move along. But I thought that before I got started with that piece, I would tell you just super quickly sort of what brought me to this kind of work and a little bit about related work that I've done previously on literary geography of the American 19th century. That stuff is domestically focused. This stuff that I'll talk to you today about is almost all internationally focused. I was interested in trying to connect those two in some way. So, motivation first. I can do this in 2 slides. One, there have been somewhere between 2 and 4 million novel-like things published in English since the dawn of time. And I think a generous interpretation of the canon, the stuff that we actually read and care about in literary studies is, what, a few hundred, 500 maybe. That means that we're reading something like 1 or 2 1/100ths of 1% of everything that's ever been published. Now, I'd be quick to admit that most of the stuff that's ever been published is terrible, but 2 things about that. 1, just because it's terrible doesn't mean it isn't interesting. And 2, even if you're only interested in the good stuff, it's hard to believe that there isn't some good stuff over in that other 99.9899% of stuff that we've really never come across. What I'd like to be able to do then, or that seems like a strong motivation, to try and get some kind of information, try and know something about this huge quantity of text that we've never encountered as professional literary critics. And then the second slide, and the second problem, is that this keeps getting way, way, way worse, which is dispiriting if you're a contemporarist, as I am. There are now something well over 50,000 new novels in English published just in the US every year. Globally, that's well over 100,000, and obviously the trend is sharply up. So this problem of abundance is getting more intense with time, and is most intense, again, for those of us who are contemporarists. I would point out, though, that if you're interested in earlier periods, this isn't an entirely new problem. I mean, if you look at the baseline here, which unfortunately my laser pointer will do nothing to indicate, it's 5,000 to 10,000 new novels a year in the US, even well back into the early part of the 20th century. And in fact, going further back, there was like a novel a week on average being published in the UK as early as about 1750. In the US, you were up to that level by the mid-19th century. So even people working in the 18th and 19th century might have trouble getting on top of that quantity of material. So it's not just contemporarists, even if we contemporarists have sort of most pressingly this problem of abundance. So that's what led me to this work. There are more specific things about a project I was working on. I'd be happy to talk to you about that, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. I did, though, want to tell you just a little bit about previous work on 19th century American literary geography. So this was stuff that I published about a year ago. I had a corpus of around 1,000 19th century American novels published between 1850 and 1875. The reason to look in that particular period was twofold. One was sort of properly intellectual. I'm interested in periodizing events. That is to say, sort of discontinuities in both social and political history and in literary development. And if you're an Americanist and you're looking for a probable discontinuity in American culture and literature, the Civil War is really the first place to go. It's not the only one, it's not the only place you might have imagined. But then, secondarily, the 19th century also happens to be where you can lay hands on a suitable large-scale corpus pretty straightforwardly without spending tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct one, as we have now done in the 20th century. So quickly, this produced results that were surprising to me. This is just a sort of overview of US domestic locations markers here sized according to the number of occurrences of each city level location and lower. One of the things that probably stands out to you about this is that if you have a rough idea of where people live in the US, even today, certainly in the 19th century, it kind of sort of looks like that. The biggest bubble there, my pointer is no good. The biggest bubble is New York. There's Boston, DC, Philadelphia, it's New Orleans, San Francisco, Sacramento. That's sort of what's standing out there. But of course, the alignment isn't perfect. I mean, it's not as though the number of people who live somewhere is the only thing driving literary attention toward a place. And in fact, so a bit of this analysis involved comparing population to literary attention. There's this dispute. So here in the top figure, blue indicates overuse relative to population share. Red is underuse relative to population share. It pains me to point out that Indiana, my home state, is the single was, I swear, the single most boring state in the Union, with the greatest degree of underrepresentation relative to population. Kansas is actually colored in there. It's just barely red. So a little underrepresented, but not quite. The second one here is in a way the more interesting figure because it indicates degree of change in over or underrepresentation across the Civil War. So things that are blue here now became either less underrepresented or more overrepresented after 1861. And the things that are in red lost interest. I won't walk through the whole thing. I will only point out that to me the two most interesting cases are Texas and South Carolina, which you can imagine is all about the Civil War. If you wanted to write about a recent war and you were an American author in the 1850s, Mexican-American War was the place to go, 1846 to 1848, and so there was a lot of use of Texas driven by interest in that war. If you're an American author writing about war in the 1860s or the 1870s, you do not write about the Mexican-American War, you instead write about the Civil War, and if you're writing about the Civil War, and this was interesting and I did not know, it is almost mandatory, apparently, to mention not just places in the South, not just the South, but South Carolina, and specifically Charleston, and specifically Fort Sumter. That's not shocking, but the degree to which that became a kind of formulaic invocation was something that was unexpected news to me. A couple of other things that stood out in this work. One was the degree to which urbanization was a major story in the literature, outpacing, in fact, even the really marked urbanization that was going on in the nation during the period. Blue here is the fraction of the US population living in either the 20 largest cities or everything the census considers an urban area, that is to say anything with more than 2,500 people in it. Not that rigorous a bar, but still. Green is the fraction of all literary occurrences that are represented by just the 20 most used cities. So literary urbanism seems to outpace demographic urbanization, even in this period, where demographic urbanization was one of the big stories in the 19th century. That led me to wonder whether or not, if literature was sort of out in front of demographic change in this case, whether that might not be true generally, whether we couldn't get a kind of predictive function out of literature. It'd be fascinating if we could. It would validate us in all kinds of ways. Unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's the case. And in fact, I'll show you two quick slides here. This is a comparison of Chicago and New Orleans. They were almost exactly the same size in 1860, but they were on really different trajectories. Red here is the population of Chicago, blue is the population of New Orleans. New Orleans had been around for a long time. It was an important city. It was growing quickly, but nothing like Chicago, which wasn't founded until the 1830s and was on this sort of rocket ride to being one of the world's largest cities by 1900. So one might have thought, if literature did have this kind of predictive function, if it was interested in places that were changing really rapidly, where people were going to be, the most vibrant locations you might imagine, that you might see more attention to Chicago. I mean, New Orleans is a known thing, but Chicago, that's new and different and exciting. That's not true, sadly. There is, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4 uses of Chicago in all of American literature, all of my corpus, before 1870. You see a few more that come in after, 1867, 68. You see a few more that come in after that, but really throughout the period in New Orleans is the more heavily used one. That looks to, so in this case anyway, a bit of backward looking. I was interested in whether or not that held up across other cities. Looks like it does. Let me unpack this just a little bit. So here I selected about 12.5 cities for which there's good census data all the way back to at or near the founding of the Republic, and said, how closely does literary usage of these cities in the period 1851 to 1875 match the distribution of population between these cities as it existed in various census years all the way back to 1790 and forward to the 1990 census. Not that I suspected there would be a close correlation there. What this shows is that the single closest fit between the distribution of literary attention and the distribution of people was in 1830. This again for literature published in the 1850s, 1860s, early 1870s. In fact, the median book in the Corpus was published in 1862. Fit here peaks in 1832. So in this case, there seems to be evidence that there's a roughly sort of 30-year lag between where people live and when people are writing about a world that reflects that distribution of population. Also happens to be the case that the median author in the Corpus was 42 at age of publication of their books. That is to say, given this 30-year lag, that they're writing about the world as they knew it when they were in their right around turning teenage years. And that, I don't want to push too hard on that, but it seems like a not absurd way of seeing formation of authors, and maybe of readers too, because this may well be demand driven. Maybe it's that readers want to read about the world as it exists in the way they understand it from something like their formative years. I have to do a lot of hand waving around that claim because I don't have a lot of other data to enrich that story, but wanted to show you that it'll eventually be potentially relevant to the work that I'm about to show you. But so I did claim, after all, that I was going to talk about the 20th century and not the 19th century. As I finished this project, I was interested in extending similar work into the 20th century. In some ways, I would be perfectly happy just to extend exactly the same kind of US domestic analysis that was presented here. But I was curious to extend both beyond the nation's borders and to look for what struck me as an important or formative sort of literary cultural studies question in the 20th century that I might be able to address using similar data. That problem is something that I've been calling the neoliberal hypothesis. I'm certainly not the first one to coin this, nor am I the first one to have noticed it. But it goes something like this. So as the 20th century has progressed, the market has come more and more to dominate not just the way in which we understand the world, but what might be a horizon of thought about understanding the world. In other words, the market has been naturalized in a way that makes it extremely difficult to think in terms other than market terms. This is a kind of standard left Marxist objection to contemporary politics, and also part of that same left Marxist framework for understanding contemporary literary and cultural production, that it reflects the imperatives of the market unconsciously, as it were, because it cannot think otherwise. If that's true, it seems to me that there should be two sort of geographic consequences that we might be able to assess with data similar to the stuff that I described for the US 19th century. One of those is that there should be some sort of reasonable alignment. I don't want to say anything more specific than that at the moment, but some kind of reasonable alignment between the distribution of literary geographic attention and the distribution of economic output, so that literature should either reflect or predict, but in one way or another line up with the geographic distribution of the marketplace. And secondly, and probably more importantly than the overall degree of fit, this fit should be getting better or closer or less delayed in time, maybe, as we go forward in the 20th century, as we enter an increasingly neoliberal era. I don't think, these may or may not be controversial claims in terms of whether or not they're right, but I don't think this is a controversial description of the implications of the neoliberal hypothesis that is quite widespread among my fellow contemporarist colleagues. In other words, this is, to me, a description of something sort of bog standard in contemporary Marxist inflected criticism, of which I am aware. To assess this, we need a couple of things. We need a suitable 20th century corpus, which does not or did not exist. We need a computational method. That one's relatively straightforward because I can do the same thing that I did with the 19th century stuff. I'll tell you a little about that in a second. And we need economic data. We need some kind of measure of the distribution of the economic marketplace. So literary corpus first. I have built in collaboration with scholars from the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois, and with kind support from Chicago's Knowledge Lab and the Templeton Foundation, a corpus of about 10,000 volumes published primarily, but not exclusively, but primarily, by American authors. Between 1880 and 1990, why stop at 1990? We ran out of money. Selected according to those works most widely held by WorldCat libraries. Now, this is another thing that I'd be eager to talk about in Q&A. It is a complicated problem with no right answer to attempt to select a representative corpus of 20th century fiction, or of any other period's literary output for that matter. Mark Algie Hewitt and Mark McGurl at Stanford have released an interesting pamphlet on this problem recently. They took a different approach, in part because they were building a much smaller corpus, one with only a few hundred books, that relied primarily on critical judgment. Also a totally reasonable way to go about constructing a corpus, but one that doesn't scale very well to a corpus even of this size, of 10,000 volumes. If you ask your friends to tell you what are the 10,000 most important novels in 20th century American fiction, they won't do it. I've tried. Main thing, so a couple things to notice about this. It's just shy of 1 billion words overall. It's big, but it's not huge. I mean, we're certainly not talking about anything like Google scale. If I'm remembering right, it's it's like 100 gigabytes or something of raw text. Yeah, I can run through it in a matter of a few hundred to a few thousand CPU hours for the NER stage. That's a lot if you're running it just on your computer, but if you've got a cluster, it's really not that bad. I can process the whole of this corpus in an afternoon. So it's not too bad. It's not huge, but it does need a cluster to work with. The other thing to notice has nothing to do with its size exactly, but is that. You know what that is already. That's the beginning of the copyright era. That it's 1923. Mostly what I would point out is, rarely do you see so clearly what is the intellectual impact of the era of perpetual copyright. Library holdings of books published in 1922 are like 3 or 4 times higher than books published in 1923, and that's not because 1922, Ulysses notwithstanding, was way more important than 1923. It's because you have to pay a whole lot more for books published in 1923 than for those originally published in 1922. This also means that the corpus is skewed, to my mind, rightly so, toward very contemporary books. You can see that there's just a larger quantity of text. This is, by the way, total number of words in the corpus by year. So something of a skew toward very recent stuff, and slight overrepresentation of earlier stuff because it's more available, not all that much in between. But so be it. That's also not too unrepresentative of what's available to people and what they might be reading these days. Processing this corpus. Two-stage process to extract geographic information from it. First, you need to identify those strings of text, little words, series of words that are used as locations. To do that, I use the Stanford Name Identity Recognizer. In this case, with the default training data, it's not such a bad fit, given that the Stanford NER is trained on 1960s through 1980s American fiction and newspaper articles. It's not great, I'd rather have it all trained on literature, but it's not ridiculous. When I did the work in the 19th century, I used a hand retrained NER data set that was a better fit for 19th century literary usage. Still thinks Charlotte's a city in North Carolina rather than a character, but can't get them all right. Once you've got these things, though, identified as locations, it doesn't tell you anything about what they actually are or where they are. So I feed those into the Google Geocoding API. It's conceptually similar to just typing each one of those strings of text into Google Maps and seeing what it comes up with. It works, roughly speaking, like magic. It's amazing. So a question that I sometimes get about this is why use Google? It obviously has a contemporarist bias, particularly for the 19th century stuff. Wouldn't you be better off with one of these several projects to do historical georeferencing? And the answer is, yeah, in principle, but Google's heuristics behind sort of guessing which location you mean are way better than anyone else's. So even though it's true, it has a contemporarist bias, which again for the 20th century isn't that big a deal. It does well enough in other ways to make up for that. Nevertheless, it certainly isn't perfect, and there is some hand correction involved. So out of this corpus of about 1 billion words, I'll forget exactly the number, but it's like 2, 3, 4 million named location occurrences. That's too many to review individually by hand. I would still be doing it and not here talking to you. But you can focus your efforts on those things that are very widely used, on books that seem to have weird, say, proportions of places. So for instance, many of you will have read Beloved, the Toni Morrison novel. You'll remember this character named Denver. That's not a city in Colorado. So fortunately, these things are relatively easy to pick out. Even a volume with pretty intensive geographic usage will use a place dozens of times, but not hundreds. There's a lot of confusion between character names and place names. There's just a ton of overlap between those two, and despite the powers of the algorithm and the heuristics built into the NER package, it does still make mistakes. But you know that if there are 500 occurrences of what's otherwise a place name, it's probably not being used as a place. You can either just say, okay, I believe that's not a place and throw them out, or you could go look at the text if it seems like if you've got enough time, which you do in some cases. So after hand correction, well, what it says up there, accuracy is good, but it's not perfect. Overall, it's about 80%. More technically, the F1 measure is 0.8, 0.79, something. Precision is better than recall. That means that of those places identified as locations following hand correction, about 90% of them are right. It means 10% of them or so aren't right, but still, not bad. If it's in the data set, it's probably right. We do a little less well on recall, so we only catch about 70% of the total locations that are in the corpus. The other 30% just don't get flagged appropriately in the first place. So you don't want to rely on this for that one book that you need to know something about. Like, read the book, you'll do a lot better. You don't even want to rely on it for a few books. But if you've got 10,000 books, it's A, the only game in town, and B, right enough to be potentially interesting, as long as you don't get too attached to any small subset of the corpus. So with those caveats in mind, then let me show you first, just in super quick overview, what shows up. So this is the entire corpus, 1880 to 1990, aggregated at the national level and mapped across the world. So this collapses everything within a nation into a single indicator. So in the case of the US, you're talking not just United States or USA, but Kansas and Lawrence and Chicago and Central Park and all of those things. Those are all grouped together here. So this is, in some ways, a nice way to look at things. I have an interactive version of the map that's kind of fun to explore. But it's hard, well, you certainly don't see anything about trends here. And if you want to get trends on the map, what you're talking about is probably something like a time series animation. But it's hard to assess, say, exactly how many more occurrences are there here of the US than there are of the UK or of France. How does that change over time? So we'd like a way to look at this that isn't just, I mean, much as I like map displays, something that isn't just that. Here then are 10 nations. They're selected for reasons that I'll go into in a minute. They're all pretty prominent in the corpus, and they also happen to have relatively good size national economies at some point in the 20th century. It's probably hard to see. They are China, Germany, France, Great Britain, India, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, and the US. Also probably hard to see, but really striking when you look at this, one of these is not like the others. Each one of these is sitting right along the baseline, except for the US, which is about 70% of total geographic location occurrences. That, for what it's worth, is substantially higher than the fraction that I saw around the Civil War. So around the Civil War, the split was 58% domestic US, 42% international. This, I like to think, I would have anticipated. I didn't form a particular hypothesis about this, but the US is a vastly more important country in world affairs these days than it was in the 19th century. There's always, well, in the data that I've seen, there's a strong home bias among authors from each country. So, the Brits use locations in the UK at a rate about 12 times higher than Americans do. Nevertheless, that's a pretty striking home bias among American authors, 70%. That's only their share among these 10 nations, but even if you include all the other nations in the world, it's still up over 60% US. So that's nice enough. We can see a little bit more of the dynamics if we leave the US out of it, so that some of those things at least come up from the baseline rather than all just looking like zero. Here, the main takeaway would be the continued prominence of the sort of cultural capitals of Western Europe. The ones that are substantially off the baseline are France, the UK, and Italy. A little bit of attention to Germany, a little bit of attention to Russia, little bit, especially late in the century, to China. Otherwise, not all that much. I have a slightly more sophisticated analysis of this, though, coming up in just a minute. First, though, analogous economic data. So one of the things that's super tricky about this work is trying to find consistently and reliably tabulated economic historical data for eras before the middle of the 20th century. So, the idea of consistently and continuously tabulated national accounts of economic output is essentially an economic invention of the post-World War II period. It's not that there isn't any economic data available before, but you're talking about a much more laborious process of historical research to try to infer what things that we would now tabulate as like GDP or employment statistics might have been in earlier eras. Fortunately, I have not had to do that myself. It would both be very difficult, and I am not a qualified economic historian, but properly qualified economic historians have done such a thing. I have borrowed these numbers from the Madison Project, which is an Anglo-Dutch collaboration that seeks to harmonize historical economic data. So these here in the figure represent historically harmonized purchasing power parity corrected GDP figures for those same 10 nations from China through the US from 1800 through 2009. Now, this is obviously not a very interesting way to present them because it looks like there was essentially no economy before the 1920s, 1930s. I'll show you a more interesting version in just a second. I will point out, though, that the very last point that's raised there, economies before 1900 are different. They're different mostly because they're not industrialized and they are certainly not highly technologized. What that means is that while it's certainly possible for one nation to be a little bit wealthier than another, essentially to be better farmers than another nation, it's almost impossible for any one national group on average to be radically wealthier than any other national group. Again, that doesn't speak to distribution within that group. You might have a whole bunch of, a small number of rich people and a whole bunch of super poor peasants, or it might be more evenly distributed. But like on the whole, the main determining factor of GDP before about 1900 is just population. If each person represents about the same fraction of, or the same amount of economic output, more people you got, the bigger your GDP is going to be. So it doesn't make all that much sense to look at GDP before about 1900. You're really just measuring population at that point. So slice this down just to 1900 to 2009 and show now not absolute levels of GDP, but relative share of GDP, again, for these same 10 countries from China down to the US. And you see something that now looks like it has a little bit of actual interesting variation in it. In fact, I would point out maybe substantially more interesting variation than the distribution of geographic attention. This is the US down here, big spike right after World War II. You see China in the upper left-hand corner, obviously substantial acceleration in GDP over the last couple of decades, but also a pretty meaningful amount of GDP based, again, mostly on huge population in the early part of the century as well. India, pretty substantial and again accelerating. Britain, France, Italy, all dropping off as a share of global GDP over the course of the 20th century. So that's the data that we're working with in the background. Simplest measure then of the sort of relationship between literary geographic attention and economic geography would be to say, what is the degree of under or over representation relative to fraction of global GDP for all of these years between 1900 or 1900 is selected here up through 1990, so essentially the full run of the corpus. Once again, though there's a little more variation here, one of these is deeply unlike the others. That's the US consistently overrepresented in every year of the sample. There's such a strong home bias. It's impossible for the US ever to be underrepresented relative to its fraction of GDP, but a little bit more variation elsewhere. I will eventually show you a version of this figure that leaves the US out and therefore shows a little bit more of the dynamics going on elsewhere. But you can certainly pick out that, Russia is underrepresented, Japan is consistently underrepresented, China and India are both consistently underrepresented, but getting a little bit better as the 20th century moves along. Brits, French, and Italians all sitting right around par. So that's one case where these just keep up with their fraction of global GDP. All right, so that's nice and all, but again, it's kind of static. And the thing that we're really interested in is the way in which an alignment between the distribution of economic production and the distribution of literary geographic attention change over time. Remember, those are the two things I said would be indicative of the correctness or validity of the neoliberal hypothesis would be that these would line up pretty well and that they would line up better or more closely as we went forward in the 20th century. So we need some time resolution and we need some way of assessing goodness of fit between economic data and literary attention data. In order to do that, I've taken these same 10 countries and measured for the 10,000 different potential combinations of year of literary output, remember that runs from 1880 to 1990, against the 110 years of GDP data that I have, that runs from 1900 to 2009. The goodness of fit between number of mentions in the literature, or share of total mentions in the literature, and share of GDP. So if these were perfectly correlated, you would see a fit line with a positive slope of 1, give or take, and with no dots skewing off of that line. You can measure, or you can assess the goodness of fit by measuring the R-squared value. This is a fairly standard statistic, in fact, a bog standard first-year statistical approach. It's nothing fancy. That roughly captures the amount of variation in the observed variable, here the literary attention, that's accounted for or that correlates with variation in the independent variable, here fraction of GDP in each of these 10 countries. This fit here, just so you have a kind of reference in mind, has an R-squared of about 0.3. That's not very good. R-squared values run from 0 to 1. 0 means totally random. 1 means perfectly correlated. Every dot falls right on the line. I'm often asked, like, what is a good R-squared value, or what is a good fit? I'm afraid that there's no general answer to that question. It depends on what you're looking at and what you're interested in. But 0.3 is low in this context. It says that GDP share does not have a particularly strong influence in this one case, which, by the way, happens to be literature published in 1971, measured against GDP share, also in 1971. But the fact that they're the same year is arbitrary. Again, there are 10,000 potential combinations. Looking at 10,000 of these things is not going to be very helpful. It's going to be hard to summarize. But you'll notice that you've got a number that tells you something about the result of this figure. That's the R-squared figure. So, next one, not yet to the last step, but next figure, is to take those R-squared values and for each year of literary output, so I'm showing you 9 of them here, but there are 110 of them between 1880 and 1990. Show the R-squared for each of the economic years between 1900 and 2009. What you'll get out of that, if you look at the highest point on each one of those, you get the year of closest alignment between the distribution of GDP share globally and the distribution of literary attention for books published in that year. So up here you've got 1967, 1968, 1969. These aren't special important years. They're just some that I pulled out more or less at random. Never trust anyone when they say they pulled them out at random. I actually have a bit of an agenda, but there's nothing truly special about these. Though it'll be very hard for you to see it from where you are, the highest point in each of these cases is is around the late 1940s, early 1950s. And this is literature published in the late 60s through the early 70s. Again, in this subset. I've got the same figures for the whole thing. That would seem to suggest that the distribution of geographic attention in the late 60s and the early 70s in literature looks most like the distribution of economic output as it existed about 20 years earlier, in the late 40s, early 50s. Nice, promising. I got excited when I saw this. Partly because it lines up sort of like with the lag that we were seeing about population shifts in the 19th century, partly because it seems plausible. I can tell myself a story about why I would expect about a 20-year lag. So, okay, this is just a little sort of window into the thing. How about the whole thing? So what I'm going to show you now is the single year of best fit. It's actually an average of the 5 best years to account for the occasional case where you get a weird single outlier, but the results are almost exactly the same. Single year of best fit over against year of literary output. If this lag were constant at about 20 years, what you'd expect to see then is a line increasing with slope 1, such that, for literature published in 1920, it would line up with GDP as it was in 1900, 1940 to 1920, 60 to 40, you get the idea. That's what it looks like. This is year of literary output from 1900 through 1990. This is a year of best or closest GDP alignment between 1910 and 1980. Son of a... So this is disappointing. Although, interesting. What it certainly is not showing is a consistent lag. Or, in fact, really anything that exactly resembles a lag at all. What it says is that it has always been 1950 as far as the literary geographic attention of American fiction in the 20th century is concerned. But that fact both masks and allows us to see a kind of important shift that does go on. Because, of course, time doesn't stand still. What that means is that for literature published in, say, 1950, there was a relatively close alignment between its monomaniacal focus on the US and the position that the US occupied in the global economy. But as we move forward from 1950, and as American literature refuses to look at the world through anything other than an obsessive return to sites within the United States, US literary geography has become more and more conservative, more and more backward-looking toward a time that no longer exists. Now, that's an awfully polemical way of putting it, and that somewhat overstates something that ultimately is about alignment between economic geography and literary geography. But I am willing to go some way down that path. The US is, economically speaking, no longer nearly so important as it was in the 1950s, but American fiction remains really centrally focused on the US and not very focused on just about anywhere else. All right, so the US is clearly the sort of driving factor here. Because something like 70% of all literary attention is devoted to sites in the US, really the only dynamic we're examining is when was the US most economically important? And that's going to be the point where you have the closest alignment between these two. So let's leave the US out of the analysis and see what else we can do. Oh, I see that I'm running a little short on time too. This is a repeat of the over and under representation figure, but now I've left the US out of things. What you see are those same three sort of European cultural capitals. France, Britain, and Italy are all consistently overrepresented. China, Russia, underrepresented, except, and Germany underrepresented as well, except maybe I'd be willing to wave my hands a little bit and say wars matter here. You know, there's a peak in attention to Russia circa the late teens, early 20s, another one around 1940 or so. Same story with Germany, although a little more later. Maybe wars got something to do with it. I'm not willing to go too far in that direction. But how about the others? So just super quickly here, China, India, and Mexico. Mexico, I'm not going to show you a figure about, but I'd like to point out that it is consistently overrepresented. In all of these figures, the black line is the 0 point. That would be perfect alignment between GDP share and literary attention share. Mexico's overrepresented for two reasons, one of which is banal, but one of which is more interesting. So partly, Mexico's GDP just isn't huge. So it doesn't take a whole lot of attention to keep up with their GDP share. On the other hand, though, I think maybe part of what we're seeing are the neighbor effects. You know, we saw this sort of huge home bias in American fiction to US locations. But it stands to reason that there would be at least some carryover to Mexican and Canadian locations as well. I'd love to have Canada in here. Canada has the terrible habit of naming their towns after common Anglo names that makes disambiguation really difficult, and I don't trust my Canada data, so I've left it out here. But that does seem to provide some tiny little piece of support, hardly the best piece of support, but a tiny little piece of support for the sort of ongoing hemispheric turn in American literary studies. Like, Mexico is relatively important, more important than its economic standing would suggest in American fiction. And it's one more among what's already a substantial litany of reasons to care about both Mexican and Latino lit as well. What I do want to show you in slightly more detail are India and China. What you're seeing here is a figure graphing location share for China and for India against GDP share across all the years in the database. So now, rather than looking at something that marches forward in time from left to right, you've got GDP share from left to right and literary attention share from bottom to top. You'd expect these to be positively correlated. More GDP means more literary attention. I mean, that was the kind of underlying gambit of the whole neoliberal hypothesis. In this case, they're not. India is kind of close to flat. China actually has an inverse relationship between GDP and attention. But this is complicated by the fact that both India and China, being huge nations, have substantial GDP fractions in the early 20th century when absolutely no American authors are interested in them at all. So part of what you're seeing here in the sort of large GDP, low representation area is early 20th century rather than late 20th century. That is to say, not really reflecting the dynamics of increased economic output there. Still, a surprising result and one that I thought was worth showing you. Finally, last meaningful slide. This is the analog of the one that just had a band of points across at 1950, showing the stasis of American attention to the US across the whole of the 20th century. This now leaves the US out. And what you're seeing is, roughly speaking, or more than anywhere else, a pattern of literary geographic attention that seems to match the economic distribution as it looks in relatively contemporary terms. You might be talked into thinking that there's a kind of bimodal distribution. It looks either like the contemporary economic outlook or landscape, or the economic landscape as it existed back in the teens and 20s. This is interesting and complicated and also a little unreliable in two ways, only one of which you can see up here. One of the ways in which this is unreliable is that when you leave the US out, the R squared values, which you can't see, all you're seeing here is the year in which the R squared value was best, but you're not getting the R squared value itself, drop quite a lot. So the year of best fit in the US inclusive case tended to be up around 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. Pretty good R squared, pretty good correlation. Here it tends to be only around 0.3 at best. So you're talking about really pretty poor correlation between economic geography and literary geography. The other thing that you can see here, and this is the sort of intellectually challenging problem, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. So let's say this is true, that the distribution of literary geographic attention in American fiction to locations outside the US has essentially always looked quite a lot like the economy looks circa 2000. Let's say that's true. Can you invent a story about why that should be true? About why, particularly the early part of the century, I mean, about why literature should have a, say, 100-year predictive function? Like, do you really believe that if you read books now, say, and look at the kinds of places that they're paying attention to, that those are the places that will be economically significant 100 years from now? Like, I got a lot of faith in literature, but I'm not sure I can tell myself a convincing story about that. So I'm not sure what to make of this, except maybe to say that it really doesn't look like there's a very good correlation between distribution of economic output and distribution of literary geographic attention outside the US in the 20th century. Like, it just doesn't look like it holds up there. Which leaves us here with my last substantive slide. Where do we stand then with the neoliberal hypothesis? Well, we certainly didn't find new support for it. I think a couple of things are possible. It may be that the variations we're talking about are just too subtle to detect in a study of this scale or using these methods. It's entirely possible that meaningful shifts, important shifts, are small in absolute magnitude. And so we don't have a sensitive enough instrument to detect them here. That's possible, because I certainly remain convinced that economics are important to the sort of form and contour and framework of cultural production. Again, not willing to throw off my Marxism just yet. But on the other hand, like, we certainly didn't see the sort of marked shift that I honestly expected, and that everyone who I talked to about this before doing the work also expected to see as the 20th century went along. And so I think we have to ask then whether or not at least the interpretation of the neoliberal hypothesis as constituting a sort of firm horizon of thought, possibility of what you can do in literature as a sort of fundamentally structuring principle, maybe that's just not right. Maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe it's an influence. Maybe it's an important piece. There certainly does seem to be some attention being driven to places that are more important, economically speaking, like India, like China, like Mexico. But maybe it isn't the same kind of horizon of possibility that we once thought it was. So I'll leave you with that. I will thank my funders, which one needs to do, even if ironically at the end of a talk that was just devoted to literature and economics. And I'll answer questions, and thank you for your forbearance. That was quite long.
Thanks. Questions? Sit down, because now I'm tired.
I have 7 questions.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. I'll just try and ask one. Okay, so just rolling off of your neoliberal, the last part. So one of the things that I don't have data for, besides anecdotal data, is that actually there's like a corollary hypothesis, the neoconservative hypothesis, right? And this is something people have written about, which is the hypothesis, especially as it pertains to nostalgia, that this sort of neoconservative shift that often attends upon the neoliberal shift exists by reference to the 1950s, right? So maybe what you've confirmed, whether or not you've confirmed the neoliberal hypothesis, could you have confirmed the neoconservative hypothesis, right? That there's something that is sort of culturally tethered to the 1950s. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and in fact, I would want to make the argument that if there's anything of value in what I just showed you. There may not be, but if there's anything of value, beyond sort of raising the general question about the power of this particular interpretation of the neoliberal hypothesis, it's the sort of perpetual 50s of American fiction. Because I don't think that that's something generally or widely sort of acknowledged or dealt with. Now, I swear this was a happenstance and accident. So it just so happens I have written a book about the 1950s in American fiction, which now turns out to be a tremendously important decade. I swear that it almost literally just now occurred to me that that's the case. I would be interested in finding other ways to explore the degree to which very contemporary fiction remains committed to a conception of the US tied to the 1950s. So obviously geography is one way to do that. It's hardly the only way to do it. So, you know, so what would you do? I mean, so some of this would presumably be a matter of repeated themes or tropes or forms. I mean, you might imagine doing some topic modeling that would say, you know, has there been any kind of either maintenance or recent shift back toward themes or forms that were prominent in the 50s?
Have you run the same data through like a network analysis program? Because what occurs to me is like what you're tracing is single references, right?
Mm-hmm.
X witnesses Y. What about the relationships between all the Ys?
Yeah, so it would be interesting to do. I've done that for the 19th century data, and it produces very sort of interpretable, apparently meaningful clusters, including some that are really sort of shocking and interesting. There's a huge nexus between Rhode Island and upstate New York, which turns out to be about novels of the leisure class. That Newport, Rhode Island, and Saratoga Springs are like the two great leisure sites of the 19th century. So maybe not shocking. On the other hand, like that was something that just sort of showed up out of the data that I didn't know about. But someone probably knew about it before, but I didn't know about it. That you always have the possibility of seeing that sort of thing. There's also an interesting cluster of pirate narratives that you get just out of the places, like it's all Caribbean islands or something. And you think, the US was really invested in the Caribbean in the 19th century. I didn't know that. Not really. They're invested in pirates, and pirates go hang out in coves in the Caribbean. But so that's, you see stuff like that, and I would like to and intend to do it. I just haven't done it yet. But yeah, it's a good idea. Because you certainly could imagine seeing a kind of reemergence of some kind of Cold War dynamic.
Right.
Maybe there's a new version of a Cold War dynamic.
Yeah.
That turns maybe a little more centrally on the Middle East now. I don't know, but I'd very much like to see what's there.
I want to know what the highest, what betweenness centrality is.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the measure of not.
Yeah.
I would be interested to know what locations have the highest index.
Yes. Well, and the question then too, just as an implementation matter, is like, what's the right level of entity to examine? It might be all of them, or do you want to restrict it just to cities? What cities co-occur or have these kind of connections? You throw states in. I don't know. It's something to play around with.
Your hypothesis that we see a lag of 30 years or so corresponding to the formative years of an author, I think is really interesting, and I'd be curious to know if you think that's limited to reflections of the world that author grew up in, or does it also reflect the literature that they were reading in their formative years? Like, do we see the things that were referenced in the literature at the time they grew up and also referenced in the works they're publishing?
And it's a really good question. I don't know the answer to it. In both of those cases, this sort of formative hypothesis can't be perfect. If it were perfect, nothing would ever change. Like if everyone only ever wrote about the world as they found it as a child, particularly if it were based on literary representations, like literature would be utterly static, which, despite the apparent stasis of US literary geography, I don't think is the case. But it seems like that's got to be part of the story. I mean, I suppose it depends on what kind of role you think literature plays in sort of intellectual formation in general, and how you think that's changed over time. You know, in some ways, this is part of a much larger question about like what English departments should be doing and whether or not it makes sense to have literature departments, or whether we should be talking about sort of media and cultural studies departments. I actually happen to be kind of on that side of things. But there's no doubt that in the 19th century, literature has a different and probably more central role in individual formation than it has now. It might be for other media, like there still might be a super important role for media and cultural production, but I doubt that it's still literature to the same extent, just given the range of available cultural forms now. I think you're on to the right idea of how you would assess that. Probably look for thematic or formal content and see what the degree of conservation of theme and form is across time. For the thematic stuff, topic modeling is probably the thing that makes sense for that. For formal assessments, I don't know. One of the things that I'm really interested in actually is in following DH in the coming decade or so are what range of approaches to analyzing form will turn out to be the sort of profitable and interesting ones. I don't think the answer to that question is clear yet. I mean, I think you're on to something interesting with the sujet stuff. That's one approach.
Yeah, I wonder if there'd be some kind of way to tag locations with how frequently they were used in the 20, 40-year window preceding that or something.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some kind of benchmark.
Yeah, that's always been part of what I've tried to say is useful about particularly the 19th century stuff. Like, even if you don't care about my analysis, and plenty of perfectly reasonable people won't care about my analysis, like, it's useful to have that kind of information. Like, if you read a book that happens to be set in Indiana, and that was published in the 1860s, it seems useful to me to know, like, whether that's weird or not. In fact, it is weird. No one cares about Indiana in the 1860s. And you might have a kind of anecdotal sense of that from your reading around the literature of the 1860s. Oh, this is the first book I ever came across that's about Indiana. But, like, again, you've got to wonder if maybe you just weren't, like, maybe there's a whole tradition of Indiana literature that you just never come across. In fact, no, there is not. No one cares. But or again, like the thing about Texas and the Mexican-American War in the 1850s and the way in which that just sort of disappears. If you come across the one book in the late 1860s that is about the Mexican-American War, like that's an interesting outlier, and it would help to have some kind of information about just how much of an outlier it might be. So I hope that separate from whatever analysis I've offered, that just these kinds of data sets are potentially useful to people doing their own work for their own purposes that might have nothing to do with me. Yeah.
I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how you built the corpus, and just how representative or non-representative you think it is, and how that might affect.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of factors that go into this. You have the general problem that, of course, library holdings are not the same thing as everything that was published. Libraries collect for their own purposes and to serve a particular clientele. Their holdings are subject to budgetary constraints. They're institutions, and they shape the corpora that they build accordingly. Other principles on which you could imagine building a representative corpus might be, you might be interested in what people were reading. So you might want sales figures or bestseller lists or something. I agree that those are quite important. They're hard to get, historically speaking. You might imagine, like, how many printings did a book go through? But of course, not all printings are the same size. Sometimes they were deliberately kept small in order to inflate the number of printings as a marketing tactic. So they're an imperfect proxy, and again, quite hard to get going back in time. You could imagine trying to construct something on sort of demographically representative principles. You know, we know that not everyone had equal access to the opportunities for publication and distribution. You know, you might well want something less full of white men than library collections are. It's not the only thing they've got, of course, but you know, you might want to correct it. In fact, one of the directions, because we now do have some more money, so we're still collecting full demographic data for all of the authors included in this corpus. But unsurprisingly, it skews white and it skews male. We're in the process of building that out sort of by hand so that you can say, you know, so you've at least got enough sort of diverse authors to run statistically significant comparative studies. You know, we're not going to get another 10,000 AFAM authors, alas, but if we had hundreds at least, you could then imagine saying, okay, well, what are some of the substantive differences between AFAM authored texts and white authored texts, that kind of thing. We're bumping up women, bumping up geographic diversity, because again, the publishing industry is concentrated in the Northeast and tends to favor Northeast authors. So all of those things, finally, I swear I'll stop talking at some point, you might be interested in something that's representative in terms of what literary critics have found important. To some extent, that's reflected by what libraries hold, because obviously that's an important constituency that they serve. But you could supplement that by saying, okay, well, what's been discussed in JSTOR journals? So JSTOR is really good about releasing data for research. And so one of the things that we're looking into is, you know, what are the most cited primary texts? It can be hard. There needs to be some processing because JSTOR doesn't necessarily flag what's a primary and what's a secondary text, and you know, it's not quite that easy, but that would be another way. What we'd like to do ultimately is have a corpus big enough, and it may be that only HathiTrust ultimately has this corpus, but we want a corpus big enough so that you can subset it to pursue any of these questions for whatever your definition of balanced or representative might be.
I have a question about the internet. I've been wondering what...
I'm against it.
You're against it, yeah. Well, your corpus ended at 1990, right? Because you ran out of funds.
Yeah.
But for the most recent body of fiction, which has been published, you know, with the development of the internet, would literary internet queries and hits eventually be of use for studies like yours?
Yeah.
And is that data, is it even collected? And then if it's collected, is it available?
Yeah, no, that's it. So that's a fantastic suggestion, and in fact something I should have mentioned in response to the last one. So yeah, there are a couple of different possibilities for this. Google won't just sort of publicly release search volumes for any terms that you might want, but they are very open to working with researchers.
And they've been keeping.
Yeah, they certainly have that data. Now, whether or not they have it sort of tagged as these are queries about literature and books. On the other hand, I put nothing past Google's machine learning capabilities.
But even if they were just keeping track of what is entered into search fields,
yeah,
could be potentially.
Yeah, no, they certainly have that data, and I would very much like to see it. The other source that we've been looking at, and that I know that Andrew Piper and the team at McGill are working on, is Goodreads data, or these sort of social reading sites. Again, skewed because the demographics of people who are super invested in books on the internet are different from the people who are reading books overall, but still it's big and interesting, and they've got a huge amount of data. It's not totally clear, you know, Amazon owns Goodreads now, and they've made noises about being open to research collaborations, and I know that that Andrew has worked with them at some level. I don't know how much they're going to release publicly, but my experience and the experience of other people in the field, I think, has been that when you approach companies with an academic study, if you can promise not to redistribute the underlying data, and if it's not a huge pain in the rear for them, if it's not a huge engineering effort, they're not opposed to this sort of stuff. But there's a big gap between what they'll do if you can find the right person to talk to and what's available sort of by default openly to everyone.
Well, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you guys. Sorry, I've totally abused your time. I appreciate your attention and your very smart engagement.
Thank you.